here with Music Marketing TV, and today we're going to be checking out the chorus inside of Harmor. Understanding the different effects can really take your sound design to the next level, and today I want to help you understand a chorus. Now, a chorus is in the family of delay effects, and what that means is it does its job by cloning a signal and delaying it. And there's three big things that come up in this area, and those are phasers, flangers, and choruses. And their differences are somewhat subtle there and how they're implemented, but their effects are pretty clear to be heard. And this chorus here can actually act kind of like a flanger as well. So basically the way it works is when you play a note or you generate a signal, in this case, we're generating a saw wave, that's going to be cloned. And when it gets cloned, it's going to do some modulation to it in the time domain that's going to cause it to phase with the original signal. You could kind of think of it like how a chorus, if you were to think of like a choir, right? Someone sings a note and then another person sings a note. Even if they're singing the exact same note, they're not going to be like the exact same signal, right? Because one's my voice and one might be your voice. If you get 100 of these people, you get this really lush sound as a result of all this phasing, all these things that don't match up, but we're all singing the same note. So I've set up here some basic settings. So this is kind of like our default, so we could just really quick get a vibe for what everything does. So the first one, the easiest spot I think to start with understanding this is the speed control. So if I bring the speed control up, it's going to change how fast that modulation is allowed to happen. And that's going to cause the phasing to change. So if I were to play a note right now, you know, nothing's happening. And if I bring the speed up, you get that. So that's what the clone is doing, and that's a result of the clone. So you can get some pretty cool effects out of the speed alone. We'll take a look at that here a little bit later, but just get in your mind, that's what speed is doing. And if we were to add, say, another copy, order 2, now we've got 3 of them. If you were to go all the way up to 9, you get 9 of them. You get a much denser thing. Now, you might be saying, well, are all of these happening at the same time? And is there a way to change that, right? Because we have 9 notes being cloned. And so what you could say is, well, yeah, you actually can. So there's a delay control here that will cause a delay between the different clones. And so I'm going to go ahead and just turn that up. And suddenly it becomes a lot more pronounced because now there's a small gap between when each one is introduced. And this allows it to sort of spread it out. And so that's going to allow us to get a much more uniform texture, just different textures. If we were to take this down, right, and if we go through the max, you can hear too, there's an initial hit and then the notes come in as they each come in. So that's going to be how the delay works. So typically you're going to want to have this up, not necessarily always at 0. And then we also have our depth. So the depth works in conjunction with the speed and controls how the speed varies. So if I bring the depth up some, you'll notice we suddenly get a much smoother texture. And that, I call it like a liquidy kind of sound. That's like classic flanger. Like when I think flanger, that's kind of the sound I think of. And those pulses are a result of the speed. And if we were to bring the speed down, we lose those pulses, maybe with a little bit less of this. And then if we bring the delay down, that liquidness sort of becomes more prevalent. If we bring it up, it loses a little bit of what it's got going on there. So that's the nature of these controls. Now the depth works in conjunction with the speed. If we were to take this down to a lower value, which will also reduce that, I'm just going to refer to it as the liquid noise. You get more classic phasing. You can make a lot of big room leads this way. If we were to bring this up some, you get that nice detuned sound. Now there's another control over here, Unison, that I'm not going to address like officially, but just know that Unison was going to take more CPU because it works on an additive level, on a per note level, where chorus works on a per voice level. It just clones the signal and makes a copy. So not necessarily per voice, it's just copying the signal. So that's going to be the chorus in general. Now we have a couple other controls. Spread will also greatly help reduce that liquid noise, because if we bring the spread up, it's going to take each one of these voices, each one of these clones, and put it in a different spot in the stereo field. So suddenly we've got a much more open sound. And there's a crossover filter that is also present, and I think it's best demonstrated by just moving it to the extremes. One extreme. So one brings the chorusing kind of down to a mono side, and the other one opens it up. And then mix, which is self-explanatory. You can have, 100% mix where it's, all chorus. You can also go the other way, which just phase inverts it if we pull it down. So usually not going to matter. So that's how the chorus works. And this is all just on a sawtooth waveform. You could mix this in. You could automate these things in. And let's go ahead and go through some presets here. So if we click down here, we've got a bunch of presets we can look at. Now we can make sense of them. So first, general settings, spread all the way up. Very wide effect. Very common to use a chorus to smooth over some things, add a little bit of mush to it. If something's really sharp sounding, a chorus can sometimes smooth out high end. And you generally have a high spread because you want it to sound bigger. So that's a lot of the motivation for adding a chorus, I think, typically. And then a higher order of voices, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4, I think is regular. If you're going for a big room lead, you might go up to 9. And in some applications, if you're doing some very specific sound design, you may like just do some very strange settings, like have 9 and then resample it and do 9 on that again and again and again. And you can get some really interesting effects that way. So that's just the default setting, nothing super crazy here. Delay is very low. Let's go ahead and go to our next. So we've got thick. So here we can already tell, just kind of picture how this is going to sound. That's the whole idea here, is we get an idea of what it's going to sound like. So we've got a high depth and a high speed, which we can already tell probably going to be some pulsing in here with a high spread, which will reduce the pulsing because it's going to be a lot more apparent when we go mono. So if we just play this. Very smooth, open texture. If we were to go ahead and reduce the spread down to mono, we get that pulsing. So that's something to take note of and just be like, okay, that's an interesting effect. You may consider automating this. If we play some lower notes, like way lower. Yeah, you get some really juicy stuff that way. And then just imagine it being a crazy bass sound. You could use this to create some really interesting movement. And then with 5 voices, you could break it down to like 1 voice to try and get more precise with the pulsing. And away you go. Here we've got Flanger. So if we play this. Classic Flanger sound. We've already kind of talked about this, but one of the things that makes this work is that the spread is very low and the delay is very low. And that's pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to this. You might try changing up the crossover filter. Can produce some interesting effects that way as well. All right, up next we've got modulation. Now, modulation, unsurprisingly, mixes 100%, so it's all chorus, and we've got the speed all the way up with the depth all the way down, which we already know is going to create a crazy wobble sound. Sounds like something off like an old keyboard or an old organ. Old organ vibes. But this should be you should at this point be able to very easily, if you hear a sound like that, make this sound just because you know of the chorus and some settings you could use. And then to wrap ourselves up here, okay, we've got vibration. You can imagine it's very similar setting. They bring the mix down a little bit so it gets mixed with the original sum. And that's going to be like the big game changer there. And they also, I believe, moved the crossover filter a bit. Not surround. Go back to modulation. Yeah, crossover also moved a bit. And then finally, we have surround flanger. Again, using the spread all the way down and making use of the crossover filter to create that stereo placement. And And that's it. That's the flanger. At this point, if we wanted to make a sound of some kind, like let's just say, okay, we're going to come in here. Let's do a square wave this time. Let's make some sort of a detune lead. Say, okay, I want a rather high setting of voices. I'm going to bring the speed up and the depth up, the delay up a little bit. Spread, I'll bring down just a smidge. We'll make a square detune. Actually, we'll bring the depth down and the crossover down. Bring the mix up. And then we could experiment things. They say, what would this sound like with a low delay and a high delay? It's not going to matter too much in this one. Bring the speed down. Then we'll say, okay, let's try the depth all the way up. See, that's a little too smooth. We'll bring it back down. And then we'll say, okay, let's try bringing the spread somewhere into a lower half. That could be an interesting variation on the lead. At this point, we could begin to experiment, you know, what would this sound like with a sawtooth? And away we go. At this point, I'd start adding in things like maybe a soft saturation. Is right here. Maybe a little bit more. And let's try out the square wave again. Just sort of whatever vibe you're going for. And then at this point, you notice we have a phaser. We could begin to add in a phaser, add in a bit more reverb. And away we go. And that's just using the chorus. I'd also like to point out real quick that I have had a very small buffer size, 16 samples, and we've had no issues with the CPU the entire time. Now with what we're doing here is pretty simple. So the Unison actually wouldn't be that tall of an order to have pumped up either. You see, we go up a little bit, but decisions like which one you use in some instances can have large impacts. So it may be worth it to default to a chorus instead of a Unison because of the way it implements the process. On what level does it implement? Unison's great for doing it's like chorusing on a per note level. So if I were to play 3 notes, that would generate 3 unisons. But if I were to play a chorus and I'd play 3 notes, it only generates, if I had this on 1, it only generates 1 voice of that. It doesn't generate 1 for each individual note. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. Subscribe and hit that bell icon for future videos, and have a blessed day.